Now?
Yes.
Ah, that sounds better. I hear the echo in my ear. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming this evening. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Vince Houghton, is the curator and historian at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. If you have not visited that museum, I think some of you here have. If you have not, please make sure you go there on your next trip to D.C. It's really an extraordinarily fun and informative museum. It's one of my favorite museums. I know there's a lot of wonderful museums in D.C., but if you find yourself in our capital sometime soon, make it a priority to go there. And actually next year they're going to be moving into a huge brand new building, so it's probably going to be even better. Dr. Houghton has a PhD in diplomatic and military history from the University of Maryland, where his research centered on U.S. scientific and technological intelligence, nuclear intelligence, in World War II and the early Cold War. His master's work, also done at the University of Maryland, focused on the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. He has taught extensively, most recently at the University of Maryland, where he taught courses on the history of U.S. intelligence, U.S. diplomatic history, the Cold War, and the history of science. Vince is also a veteran of the United States Army and served in the Balkans, where he worked closely with both civilian and military intelligence agencies in several capacities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vince Houghton.
Thank you, Jordan. It's a pleasure to be here. I came on a whim. I was in Las Vegas about a year and a half ago and said, it's a cool sounding museum. That's right down my alley when we pop by. And just kind of fell in love with what's going on here, and had a quick conversation with some of the people in charge. And then Jordan reached out to me at one point, and I said, absolutely, I'll come do the talk out in Las Vegas. I mean, it's wonderful. This is the best weather I've seen in months and months and months and months. We've had a horrendous, the Northeast has had a horrendous winter, so Jordan's like, oh, that's like 3 blocks down. I guess you guys don't walk all that much, and we walk everywhere in DC. And he's like, oh, come pick it up. I'm like, I haven't had weather like this since like September. I'll happily walk to the museum tonight. So it's a pleasure to be here. I have notes in front of me, mainly so I don't go for 3 hours, because I tend to talk a lot. So my notes will kind of keep me on track. We all have hockey we have to watch at some point tonight. I'm as much interested in what's going on as you might be, maybe not as much, but I certainly pay attention too. So I appreciate you taking the time to come here to listen to me when there's so much going on here in Las Vegas. So as Jordan mentioned, this is my background. Actually, what you're going to be hearing tonight is a chunk of what was at one point my doctoral dissertation, and will be a book soon-ish. It's already done. I don't have to do anything with it. It's just when the publishing company decides to put it out. And so it is what we call in the history community, which is kind of ironic, it's state of the art. Some of the research you won't find anywhere else. Some of this research I did, I got FOIA'd, I got stuff declassified for this. And it's a story that doesn't get told very often. One of the reasons it doesn't is because of the way we do history in a very broad sense. And what I mean by that is it's difficult to learn stuff from history. And as a historian, I'm telling you there's limitations in what history can actually teach us about the world, because we find ourselves being beholden to knowing the ending already, right? So we know what happened, it's history. We have an idea of the end of the story. In this case, we're talking about the development of a German atomic bomb. Well, we know they didn't develop a bomb. We know we beat them to the atomic bomb. So how do we actually take ourselves out of that knowledge and use it to where we can put ourselves in the shoes of the people who are working at the time, and feeling at the time, and understanding at the time, and being afraid at the time what the Germans were up to. And so our first step is you must unlearn what you have learned. From the wise words of Master Yoda, you have to pretend you don't know the ending to this story. You have to assume that the Germans are just as likely to get the atomic bomb in World War II as the Americans are. Because the only way we can actually get anything other than just a storytelling experience tonight is to be able to become empathetic. Is to be able to say, I want to put myself in the shoes of these intelligence professionals and policymakers to understand why they were so afraid of the possibility of a German bomb. And it goes just beyond debate Hitler with a bomb. That's scary enough as it is. But the idea beyond that was, are they in a position to beat us there? And so unlearn, pretend you don't know the ending to this, because history done right is when we do history this way, when we don't assume we know the ending. Even when we do, there's ways that we can put ourselves in a state of kind of suspending our knowledge of history. You can see that in some very good movies. So good history are movies like Dunkirk, like Lawrence of Arabia, like Titanic, right? Like Argo. Anyone seen the movie Argo? All right, well, you were in Tehran or you were, okay. So Tony Mendez is the man that Ben Affleck plays. He's a friend of mine. He's a board member at the National Spy Museum. And when Argo came out, and you and I about good movies, he was watching it in the theater, and at the end of the movie, he was gripping the chair rest. I'm like, Tony, dude, you know you got out. You were there, right? But the storytelling was done so well that people who were watching this were able to suspend their disbelief, to be able to say, okay, I know the ending, but I'm still able to put myself in the shoes of the people there. I'm still able to feel the fear that those people felt as they were trying to escape Iran. I was still able to empathize with the feelings that they had. Now, this is when it's done well. When it's done badly, it's just a narrative, it's just a storytelling. When we know the ending of something and we can't feel the same way they felt, then you get a story like this. Where the Star Wars, I'm a big Star Wars fan, obviously, as you can tell. These were movies that came out and we knew the ending, right? We knew the little stupid kid who was a terrible actor was going to become Darth Vader one day. And because it wasn't done well, we couldn't empathize. We couldn't really identify with the characters. We couldn't understand, or better yet, we didn't care what they were thinking and they were feeling. So that's what I want to implore you to do, because the key here is trying to understand why the Americans were so terrified of the idea behind a German bomb. So, of course, Hitler the bomb is problematic. That's a big issue. But there's more to it than that. There's a big misunderstanding that the American policymakers, American intelligence professionals had about the German atomic bomb program that made us especially afraid of what would happen. The first one is we thought they had a head start. We thought the Germans had started their atomic bomb program way before we did. We started ours in earnest in 1942. That's when the Manhattan Engineering District was set up, the Manhattan Project. That's when Leslie Groves was given command of building the atomic bomb. And we assumed that the Germans had been working on this for 2 years at this point. That they had a head start, that any day we would have to be worried about them dropping an atomic bomb on our heads. And so estimates, and intelligence agencies do estimates. They try to predict the future, they try to predict where countries are. Estimates said that the Germans were ahead anywhere from a minimum of 6 months. So even the most optimistic people assumed that the Germans were at least 6 months ahead of us, to a maximum of 2 or even 3 years already in full development of the atomic bomb. And this was a consensus. This wasn't just some guy saying the sky is falling in the Pentagon. This was a consensus within the scientific community that the Americans were far behind the Germans in scientific research. And some of this information was coming in from a lot of different places, from what was known as the scientific underground. Now, you know the story, I believe, of the 1930s when Hitler comes to power, that a lot of Jewish scientists ran for the hills, and rightly so. A lot of them came to the United States, some went to Britain, in an attempt to escape what was obviously coming with the Holocaust. And others, like Enrico Fermi, who was Catholic himself, had a Jewish wife, and so he too came to the United States. But some people did remain. Those that did not think that they would be wrapped up in the Holocaust, usually people of Christian background, and they stayed and actually were able to pass along information from inside Germany in many cases, but also inside Europe, about what German development was doing. And unfortunately, this was not a well-maintained spy ring. You think about some of the famous spy rings throughout history where good information is being passed along. One of the great ones is during the Revolutionary War. There's a TV show called Turn about it on AMC, but the Culper spy ring, where spies were able to give all this great information about what the British were doing inside New York City. And it was passed along, and it went from person to person to person to person, finally back to George Washington. And by the time it got to him, it was really good information. That's not what happened in the scientific underground. It was like a game of telephone. You know, a game of telephone where you tell somebody one thing, and then it's passed along, and by the time it finally gets to you, it's dramatically different. It's changed completely. Well, when information came out of Germany and was passed along and finally made it to the United States, it increased in severity. So someone in Germany might say, I heard a German scientist talking about atomic physics, and would mention that to say somebody in Belgium. And the Belgian guy would pass information along to somebody in the UK saying, the Germans are working on a bomb. And the UK guy would pass something along to the American and say, the Germans are about to build it, they're almost done. And it would just get more and more severe as this information was passed along. So this was a problem, because this is the only intelligence that we had at the time. We did not have any kind of apparatus for bringing in information about how close the Germans were, so we were only counting on second, third, even fifth-hand information coming from overseas. But what this did is also reinforce information that we knew already. There's times we talk about confirmation bias. We heard that term before. There's a real problem in intelligence analysis where you have a preconceived notion, and then you look at intelligence that's coming in, and you ignore the stuff that disagrees with what you already believe, and you readily accept the stuff that agrees with what you do. So in this case, we believe that the Germans were way ahead of us. And so information coming in about their capabilities, about their facilities, about their scientists, just reinforced that idea. And if you think about it, the Germans were, it wasn't wrong to think the Germans may be way ahead of us. The facilities, the scientists, the industrial infrastructure they had made a whole lot of sense. For one thing, they had an institute called the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. And it was essentially, if you took Harvard, Yale, MIT, or Chicago, and Berkeley and wrapped them all into one, this is where all the top physicists and scientists went to study. At one point in the 1920s, just to give you an idea, there's 3 different Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes. The directors of the 3 were, the Physics Institute was Albert Einstein. The Chemistry Institute was a man named Fritz Haber, who, if you don't know his name, he was the most important chemist in the world during World War I. And then Otto Hahn, who was the future discoverer of nuclear fission, was the physical chemistry founder. So 3 institutes with 3 of the most important scientists who ever lived were running these organizations. Then you have to think about what the Germans had captured during the war, including Niels Bohr's institute in Copenhagen was also under control by the Germans. Frederick Juliet Curie's institute in Paris was also under the control of the Germans by the time we're starting to think about the atomic bomb. Now that's important too, because Juliet Curie had Europe's only cyclotron. Actually, the cyclotron, anyone know what some of you physics people might know what a cyclotron is. To keep it really simple, it's a very important tool for accelerating particles to an incredibly high speed to allow for artificial nuclear fission. It's a particle accelerator. And they've just been invented. A man named Ernest Rutherford invented them in the UK. And then Lawrence Livermore, for the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory here, perfected them to a degree. The cyclotron was a key element in building atomic weapons. And the Germans had just gotten their hands on one by capturing Juliet Curie's institute inside Paris. Can't make a bomb without materials, right? Uranium is a key component to an atomic bomb. Well, in this case, the Germans were arguably better off than even we were here. They had captured the world's greatest uranium-producing mine in Czechoslovakia during the 1938 annexation of the infamous Neville Chamberlain appeasement annexation of Czechoslovakia. Because they had conquered Belgium, they captured the second best mine for uranium production in the Belgian Congo, because Belgium no longer could take care of its own colonies there too. And then an innovative way, they thought, at least at the time, of enriching uranium was a substance known as heavy water. And heavy water we kind of toyed with to figure out whether or not it made a lot of sense as what's called a moderator. It slows down neutrons to actually allow you to make a chain reaction easier with less critical mass. We decided to use graphite. But we went there in a long process of trying to heavy water, does it work? Beryllium, does it work? Graphite ended up being what we chose. But the #1 production facility in the world for heavy water, which at the time was still considered an important concept and ingredient for nuclear weapons, was in Norway, which had also been captured by the Germans. So we looked at this and said, man, they have every single possible ingredient in a physical sense to be ahead of the United States. Now, You can have all the materials that you want, but if you don't have good scientists, it really doesn't get you very far. And a lot of people have the misperception that all the really good scientists left, and they all came and worked for us. Right? The Manhattan Project was made up of lots and lots of European scientists who had fled Eastern Europe and in Central Europe because of the Nazis. But a lot of them stayed behind. A lot of them remained. And German science at the time was considered the best in the world. Now, we know a lot of the names of the people who worked in the Manhattan Project because they worked on the Manhattan Project and built an atomic bomb. But they weren't necessarily all that famous at the time. And I try to explain this to history science students who are like, how good were the scientists in the Manhattan Project? You just pull down a periodic table of the elements and say, see these last like 15 elements? Every one of them is named after somebody who worked on the atomic bomb. But that was after the fact. At the time, in the 1930s and 1940s, everyone assumed that the Germans had better scientists than we did. There's a reason for that. So graduate students, so someone studying for physics at any of the prominent German institutes could expect to receive graduate level physics training from people like Max Planck, who invented quantum theory, quantum mechanics, Albert Einstein, Erwin Schrödinger, and his stupid cats, and people like Max Born, who took Planck's ideas and made them much more modern. And then, of course, Werner Heisenberg, who we'll talk a little bit more about later. To give you an idea, during the first half of the 20th century, Germany won more Nobel Prizes in science than any other nation, most of them in physics and chemistry, and not just more. If you combined the Nobel Prizes in the 1930s of all the other nations in the world, they still wouldn't add up to as many Nobel Prizes as the Germans won just in their one country. And that's after everyone had left. That's during the time of Hitler. The funny part is, many of the Manhattan Project scientists, the people that we consider the cream of the crop, actually did their graduate or postdoctoral work in Germany under some of the physicists that stayed behind. People like Robert Oppenheimer, Hans Bethe, Edward Teller. All of these guys had studied under the German scientists who were still there. Fermi and Wolfgang Pauli and Victor Weisskopf. These are the who's who of the Manhattan Project. And all of them had as their dissertation directors and their graduate student professors the scientists that still remain behind in Germany. Talk about Heisenberg. Let's get a little bit more into him. Anyone heard the name Werner Heisenberg before? Anyone heard it without watching Breaking Bad? Okay, so a couple of you. The irony there is Breaking Bad was a very popular show on AMC, if you haven't seen it, where the main character, the kind of anti-protagonist, was a chemist who went by the name Heisenberg. That was he's a chemistry teacher that becomes a meth producer. And his drug name is Heisenberg. The irony is Heisenberg was a physicist, not a chemist. So I always got kind of pissed off when they did that. But the idea of the genius in Heisenberg was he was only 22 years old when he was awarded his doctorate, which is really young. That means that he essentially started his doctorate degree when he was a 16-year-old. I don't know how many 16-year-olds out there are running around getting doctorates in physics. I was thinking about other things when I was 16 years old. Some not so dirty as me or mine are going, but baseball and other things. Heisenberg was thinking about changing the world and doing it in an extraordinary way. By 26, he was a full professor. If anyone's done any kind of education work, that takes some time. And by 32, he was Nobel laureate for his ideas on quantum theory. And people know the name maybe Heisenberg because of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is one of those defining physics principles. And it's basically at the level of Einstein's theory of relativity. And the amazing thing about Heisenberg is that's not what he won his Nobel Prize for. He won it for something else. Matrix mechanics, which we're not even getting close to having a conversation about. If you've heard the name Richard Feynman, another very famous and prominent American physicist, he said that anyone who claims to understand quantum theory is lying to you. And so I'm not even going to try to explain any of it to you. I have a pretty good grasp of it, but we don't have the time for that. And the really scary thing about him was that in 1939 he took a trip to the United States. And this is before the war broke out, so this is not yet September. So summer 1939 he did a tour through the United States and met up with a lot of his former grad students who are now people like Robert Oppenheimer, who's working at Berkeley, or Enrico Fermi, who's working at the University of Chicago, or Einstein at Princeton, and just said, basically a tour about a month through the United States. And at every stop, the people of America asked him to stay here, right? Europe's about to go to war. Germany has this crazy man in charge. Just stay here. We can get a job anywhere you want. You want to run MIT? You can run MIT. You want a job anywhere? You got a job anywhere. And as he went through, every single American scientist or European who had now immigrated to the United States said, Werner, just stay here. And it's his answer that scared them so badly. His answer was, no, Germany needs me. I'm a true German nationalist. Germany is about to be in a war, and they need me to help them win the war. Now, that's the last time they talked to him, was him saying, I'm going to go off and help Germany win this war. So all that came together and led to a belief that Heisenberg, arguably the smartest quantum physicist in the world, was going to be heading the German atomic bomb program. Then the last thing to look at support from the German hierarchy. And as we know, this is incredibly expensive work. We spent $2 billion in 1940 money on the Manhattan Project. You can extrapolate how much that would be today. We had to build 3 cities here in the United States, Los Alamos, New Mexico, and out there. There's actually a pretty large facility there. It was nothing. It was an old boys' school. It was basically a horse barn before we got a hold of it. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, these were little one-horse hitch towns until we went in there and turned them into major cities. So it takes an enormous amount of government support in order to have an atomic bomb program. Well, with the German support, what the German scientists were trying to do, and a man named Samuel Gutsmith, I don't know if you've heard his name or not, he was a prominent American scientist, worked on the Manhattan Project, was also key in doing American atomic intelligence, as we'll talk about in a second. He wrote a book after the war where he talked about that perception of American scientists towards the German high command. And this is a quote, and I'll read it out in case it's hard to see. He made an interesting point about how it might be even easier in Germany for them to build a bomb than it was for us in the United States. Because in the US, you had to pay living wages. You had things like OSHA. You had to worry about people dying on the job. You couldn't use slave labor. You actually had to figure out economically, can we afford to do this? You can't have a command economy and say, no, we're going to stop making milk in order to build an atomic bomb. But as Gutsmith points out, totalitarianism gets things done where democracy fumbles along. And he made a interesting point. So the branches of science that really mattered to the war effort for the Nazis, they were able to cut all the corners. They were able to do whatever they wanted to do with the kind of efficiency that we can only dream of having. There's a bigger problem on top of this that we knew about, that we were worried about. One of which was the fact that some of the German high command, names you've heard of, Hermann Goering, who was the head of basically everything under Hitler, Hitler's chief deputy, was the head of the German Research Council. He was essentially the guy who was in charge of all science and development inside Germany. So you had the guy who had Hitler's ear. The number 2 person in all of Germany was their top scientist. Now, Goering wasn't a scientist. Goering wouldn't know anything scientific if you put it in front of him, but that was his job. So he certainly took it seriously and was able to put this information in front of Hitler. Arguably more important was that Heinrich Himmler, another one of Hitler's lackeys, was someone who was responsible for doing more to cause the Holocaust than anyone other than Hitler, if you know his background. Essentially, he was the architect of the Holocaust. He was a close personal friend of Werner Heisenberg. He was somebody that grew up knowing their families had vacation together. This is somebody who was very close. And this fact was widely known to Americans. So American scientists understood how close Heisenberg was to the German high command. And they feared his relationship with Himmler would be exploited to promote German atomic bomb research. And then there's finally the most direct relationship between German science and the German government was that of German physicist Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. This name may ring a bell to some of you, maybe not. He was a colleague and close friend of Heisenberg. They did a lot of joint projects together. Good physicist, actually very good, and it was assumed by the Americans that he would be an integral part of any kind of atomic bomb program. The problem was, and this is not why the Americans were worried about him, the problem was that he was someone who had incredibly close ties to the German high command. His father, Ernest von Weizsäcker, was one of Hitler's top diplomats, was somebody that was well within the German command. And his brother would later become a top secretary in von Ribbentrop's foreign ministry. Talk about a direct line to the Fuhrer. Actually, the reason Weizsäcker's name is known is because in 1939, there's a famous letter that was written, people think by Albert Einstein to Franklin Roosevelt, warning him about the fact that the Germans might be working on a bomb. The Einstein letter, as it's known. Einstein didn't write it, and Leo Szilard wrote it, and anyone heard of Leo Szilard?
Yeah.
All right, well, you're like the 10 people in the world that have heard of Leo Szilard, and that was Szilard's problem also. He realized that if he had sent a letter to FDR, no one would ever read the letter he sent to FDR. But if Albert Einstein had sent a letter to FDR, everyone would pay attention. And Szilard and Einstein knew each other. So Szilard went to Einstein and said, look, I'm really worried about what the Germans are doing. They have all these facilities, they have all these scientists, they have von Weizsäcker. Will you sign the letter I wrote and we'll send it to FDR? And Weizsäcker's name is the only one actually in that letter. That gets the whole process started. FDR actually reads this letter and says, we better do something about this. Let's start investigating building our own bomb. And it was because of the fear of the German bomb program. So it's kind of counterintuitive, these next couple ones. So even if the Germans couldn't build a bomb, the worry was that they would be able to enrich enough uranium to create enough radioactive material to do what we now commonly refer to as a dirty bomb. Now, all of you are far too young to have been involved in any kind of fighting during the war. So your parents and your grandparents, think about them raiding the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944. The boats go up, the ramps drop, they run into the beach, and all of a sudden some bombs go off, but they don't kill anybody, they just release gas. Not chemical gas, radioactive gas. Imagine what D-Day would have looked like if the Germans had dropped dirty bombs along the beaches of Normandy, or on our forces trying to move into Germany later in the war. If all of our brave men and women, and there were a lot of women there actually doing some important work, were essentially exposed to radioactivity to the point where it killed them. This was a huge fear, because we knew that radioactivity existed. We knew from our own research that this would be a possible weapon of war in the future. And we thought that even if the Germans aren't unable to build an actual bomb, they might be able to build something that would irradiate huge swaths of Western Europe. And then that second bullet point to me is the most interesting. What made us the most afraid about the German program was the American program. Not that we weren't succeeding in building a bomb, but that we were. Because when things were theoretical, when the Manhattan Project scientists first got together and started having chats about building a bomb, and they started writing formulas up on the blackboard, at that point it was just science. It was just math. It was just stuff that maybe one day would become something interesting. But as the program developed, as Enrico Fermi built an atomic reactor under a sports field at the University of Chicago, as we got closer and closer to developing weapons that might work, our anxiety about the German program got higher and higher. It went from theory to almost certainty. And we knew if we could build it, based on what we thought about the Germans, that they could build it. So as, again, counterintuitive, right? You think as a deterrent, the whole Cold War was based on the idea that if we can build a bomb, then we're not worried about their bomb. But the more we got confident that we could legitimately build an atomic bomb, the more afraid we were about their capabilities. And this actually kicked off a second Leo Szilard letter. After Enrico Fermi successfully tested his atomic pile, his atomic reactor at the University of Chicago, Szilard wrote a letter to a man named Arthur Compton, who was the #2 guy under a man named Vannevar Bush, who was running all American science during the war. And then Compton was freaked out enough by this that he talked to Bush, and then Bush had the ear to FDR. And all of this came together to create an understanding in the American government that we needed to do something to figure out how far along the Germans were. We needed to find a way to discover their progress so that the first, and I don't say this to be kind of insensitive, The Japanese found out the hard way that we built an atomic bomb, right? The people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki found out the hard way. We didn't want New York and Washington to be the first instances of us knowing the Germans had built the bomb. We didn't want an American city to be obliterated as saying, oh, they figured out how to do it. We needed to figure out a way to discover the extent of their atomic bomb research, atomic bomb program. And so when the letter from Szilard went to Compton, the Compton letter to Bush, and finally Bush to FDR, Franklin Roosevelt said, something has to be done. We have to create an intelligence program in the United States to actively try to find out what the Germans are up to. But it's not that easy. And there's a reason it's not that easy, because what we're talking about here is scientific intelligence. Now, scientific intelligence is something that we've been doing now for the last 70 years. It sounds like we should have been doing it for our entire existence. But what's interesting about scientific intelligence is that it's new. This had never been done before in World War II. And that's kind of this, again, going back to unlearning what you've learned. So we think of science and technology as two things that go together. Research and development, two things that go together. But that had not been the case before World War II. Right? Science and technology existed in different planes. When technology was done prior to the Second World War, it was done empirically. Right? That's a fancy way of saying trial and error. Right? So you didn't build a bridge based on physics principles. You built a bridge because you thought it might work, and then you sent something over it, and the bridge collapsed. You said, oh crap, let's build it a different way. And you built it a different way. And then someone went over it, and it fell again. Like, okay, let's build it a different way. It was trial and error. It was not based on an understanding of physics and mechanical engineering and all the things that we use to build bridges today. Right? Science and technology did not coexist. So when science was done, it really didn't matter to a lot of people. It wasn't something that mattered to our national security. What people were doing inside laboratories did not have practical implications that could be a threat to us in the future. So no one paid attention until about the mid-1930s, when certain inventions were created that directly took science in a laboratory to battlefield implications. And one of these was radar. All right, so you have radar, which is a scientific application directly applied to warfighting, and the British were on the forefront of that. Another one was cryptography. If you include mathematics as a science, as I do, that was mathematical principles that were applied directly to code-breaking efforts during the war. One of these were atomic weapons, obviously a scientific laboratory research that had practical implications. And the final one was actually something that was operational research, or operation analysis. And this is something that we know a whole lot about today. And this is taking scientists and actually putting them in positions to be policymakers. Taking scientists and putting them in positions to be military strategists. It started actually with the guys who invented radar in Britain in the 1930s, because the generals who were figuring out how to use radar didn't know how it worked, didn't understand how to use it effectively. So they actually brought in the scientists who created it and said, how do we use this? Where do we put it? Where can it be most effective? How can we actually use it tactically and operationally and strategically to help beat the Germans? And so thousands of scientists were brought into government in the 1940s to help us fight these wars. Now, when the war ended, they weren't just kind of kicked back to civilian world. They were brought together in institutes and organizations that were created by governments that today we call think tanks. The first one was RAND. You know what RAND stands for? It's an acronym. Research and Development. It was created by the Joint Chiefs of Staff based on the U.S. Air Force to make sure you can hold on to some of these atomic physicists who had helped build the atomic bomb to figure out how to fight the Cold War. And if you think about it, Eisenhower, Patton, MacArthur, these guys, if they took science in school, it was back in 1905, when their physics education includes stuff like, you know, here's what light does, and it's Newtonian physics. It's not quantum mechanics. The people who know quantum mechanics are the 25-year-olds, right? It's like your grandkids, your kids, you know, understanding computer science today. My father was a computer scientist, but when he got to 60, 65, he was calling him, I'm a historian, but I was the one teaching him how to use his computer. Because eventually, technology had moved beyond that. So who better than to plan the strategy of fighting the Cold War than the 25-year-old kids who were the scientists who were coming up with how to actually create these weapons. So all of that was brought together during the Second World War to make science important and to make science a key national security issue. But it was brand new, which meant that intelligence about science was brand new also. Why collect intelligence about something that no one cares about? So by being new, nobody knew how to do it. So it was made up as they went along. The issue also is that it's fast, it's rapidly evolving, right? I don't, this is something kind of people see today. If you tell this to a 14-year-old, they're like, yeah, duh. But you don't necessarily think about it, about how quick technology moves today. The steam engine, all heard of the steam engine, was first conceptualized in the 3rd century. Way back. The first working steam engine was produced in 1715 by a British man named Thomas Newcomen. It took another 150 years before they could miniaturize it and put it inside a locomotive or a steamship to actually make it work for us. So you go 1,400 years, and then 150 years, right? That's slow moving. That's where you can kind of sit back if you're an intelligence officer and say, I'm not too worried about this technology right now. But take my father again. My father was born in 1940. When he was born, the fastest flying aircraft, it depends on who you ask, was either the Spitfire or the Hurricane. Traveled about 400 miles an hour. By the time he had graduated from high school, we had an aircraft that was flying at over 3 times the speed of sound, the SR-71. And by the time he was 29 years old, we were walking on the moon. He's not even 30 yet. And you can go from a propeller-driven Spitfire aircraft to Apollo 11. That's technological change, right? I mean, you might know this anecdote is kind of, this is an iPhone 8 or something like that. The iPhone 3 has 10 times as much computing power as the computers that put Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon. And we're already having conversations about when will we have artificial intelligence? When will we have the ability to do quantum computing? When can we literally, I think it was 2 years ago, scientists were actually able to teleport a quanta, so a group of essentially information, teleport it about 5 feet. That doesn't sound like a lot. By teleport, I mean like Star Trek teleport. Like it didn't travel between those 5 feet. It went from one place to the other without doing anything in between. It went whoop, and it came over here. That's extraordinary. And think about 5 years ago, we weren't even coming close to thinking about that. So the key with scientific intelligence is because of the fast pace, because of how things are moving, not only are you making it up as you go along, because it's brand new, but even when you're learning how to do it, it's changing every day. Again, think about this in the context of the Manhattan Project. If you're an intelligence officer, I don't care if it's scientist or otherwise, you have a pretty good idea of what you're looking for. So if I'm a Sovietologist for the CIA in the 1960s, and I'm focused on the Soviet military, a new Soviet tank comes out, I know what I'm looking for. I want to know how thick the armor is, how effective the fire control system is, how much fuel it has, how the range is. All those things I know what to look for. But nuclear science barely existed at the time, and not only that, it was constantly changing. So as an intelligence officer, if I'm doing scientific intelligence focused on the Germans, not only am I constantly changing what I'm looking for, but I'm going to come back to the United States and talk to the Manhattan Project guys and say, all right, what's new? Right? What have you done in the last couple of weeks that all of a sudden matters to me? So it was, talk about making as you go along. That's really the theme behind this. And then we talk about personnel problems. And to me, this is the most interesting aspect of this issue, is because as savvy and suave as James Bond is, and he had a great education at Eton, probably went to Oxford, and had all the best suits and the best cars, and certainly knew how to parachute out of a perfectly good airplane with a martini in one hand and a dumbly named blonde in the other. He was not a nuclear physicist. So if you put him in a nuclear power plant or in a top secret nuclear facility, he's as dumb as the rest of us. I don't care how good he is at being a spy. Now, if we went to UNLV and we took a top-level physics professor and pushed him out the side of an airplane, parachute or not, he's probably not going to be in his element. And that's the issue that you run into, is that spies didn't know physics. They didn't understand science. They understood how to kill people. They understood how to understand economics and political science. But they weren't very proficient at knowing a brand new science that just been created. On the other hand, scientists, they make very good spies. And that's the problem that you run into here. The majority of the intelligence officers in the 1940s did not possess a scientific or technological degree. And even if they did, it's not just good enough to have a science education. Science is lots of things. If I have an oceanography degree, it doesn't really help me understand nuclear physics. If I have a biology degree, I'm not going to understand high-level chemistry. I might have the basics, but certainly not the literacy level necessary to understand top-secret research. So it's not just good enough to get a political scientist or an economist. You have to get someone very specific. You need a nuclear physicist to do nuclear intelligence. You know, I have a physics background. I can hold my own in some of these conversations, but put me learning biology, chemistry, oceanography, marine, none of those things, I would be lost. And then finally, linguistic skills. It's not enough to understand German. You got to understand German at a technical level. Because you're not just reading reports about the German army moving around or reading reading propaganda documents. You need to understand quantum mechanics in English and German. Hard enough to understand it in one language, let alone two. So you need this combination of assets that just didn't exist. You needed a James Bond that had a PhD in physics and could speak German at a technical level. Right? Good luck. Right? There are probably 10 of those in the CIA today. Right? This is a time when we hadn't been paying attention to this. So the best we could hope for at the very beginning of this process was doing what we call mirror imaging. And mirror imaging is incredibly problematic. By mirror imaging, it's an analytical fault. It's an analytical bias that can get us into a lot of trouble. And basically, it's exactly what it sounds like. We looked at the German program and said, we're going to look for all the indicators of the German program that are similar to ours. We're going to look at them and say, what benchmarks might we be trying to find out? Because those are the benchmarks that we're doing. Basically, we're going to treat them as though they're going to act exactly the way that we're going to act. That's not a good idea, right? As we already talked about, they're in an entirely different system of government. They're doing things very different. Sadly, they have thousands of people for slave labor that we can't even come close to. It would be equivalent today, some people do this, it's a bad idea, to say Kim Jong-un and the North Koreans are going to do things exactly the way we are. Probably not a good idea, but that's all we had to go on. All we had to go on was trying to treat them as though they were doing it exactly the same way we were. And that's where things become problematic, because no one had any better ideas. Well, there were some ideas, but they weren't better. There were some interesting ideas from some of the scientists. I talked about scientists weren't necessarily James Bond. A couple of them tried to be. There's an idea for a covert action. Hans Bethe and Victor Weisskopf, these are two MRA scientists who were part of the Manhattan Project. They had an idea. They had heard through the scientific underground, the telephone operators, that Werner Heisenberg would be giving a talk in Zurich in 1942. We're going to talk about Heisenberg in Zurich in 1944 in a couple minutes. Heisenberg in Zurich in 1942, and they had an idea, let's go talk to him. Let's go try to convince Heisenberg to drop what he's doing and come to the United States. Now, the intelligence personnel said that's not a good idea. I'm like, why not? Well, because then you're basically telling Heisenberg that we're working on a bomb. That's not something we wanted the world to know at the time, right? If you go to Heisenberg and say, come over to us, you get a chance to work on something really cool and really neat and secret, he's going to know exactly what you're talking about. And of course, if Heisenberg says, yes, we've got no problem, but if Heisenberg says, go to hell, and then goes back to the Germans and said, we better get cracking, the Americans are building a bomb, then we're in big trouble. So they were talked out of that, and they decided they'd go with plan B. And plan B was, they said, send me, this is Weisskopf, send me and Hans over to Zurich, and we'll kidnap Heisenberg. And we'll grab him, and we'll kind of drug him, and we'll pull him into a car, and we'll bring him back here to the United States. I wish I had pictures of them. There's no good ones. There's only ones at the end of their lives. Now, they were relatively young at the time, but they would be a good NFL punter, not a good NFL linebacker. These were very thin, skinny, wiry scientists. And Heisenberg was like 6'3". The idea of them, I'm a pretty big dude too. It'd be like a 5-year-old trying to grab my leg and pull me into a van. And so the intelligence guys kind of chuckled at that and said, you guys are crazy, we're not doing that. We need to do something, we need to bring in the professionals. We need to bring in people who actually know what the hell they're doing. The problem is, as we've discussed, the professionals were not equipped to do this. The intelligence agencies in the United States at the time, and there were three. There was the Office of Naval Intelligence, which is exactly what it sounds like. There was G2, better known as Army Intelligence, and then there's a fledgling intelligence organization known as
OSS.
the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was really fledgling at the time. But none of them really understood how to do scientific intelligence. There was a lot of bureaucratic infighting about who should be in charge of it. And actually, they weren't fighting about who should do it, they're fighting about who should not do it. The OSS is like, no, you guys, O&I, you take it. O&I is like, we don't want to do it. G2, you take it. G2 is like, let's give it to the new guy, OSS. So no one wanted the responsibility to do this because no one knew how to do it. And so they're trying to push it off on each other. No one really looked at it as a priority collection. They were focused on other things. O&I wanted to know how to track German submarines. And G2 wanted to know how good was the new Tiger tank. And OSS was too busy running around drinking themselves to death. Bill Goggman, who was the head of the OSS, basically said, I'm looking for PhDs who can win in a bar fight. We got the bar fight part. The OSS was informally known as Oh-So Social, because they were very good at going and drinking themselves under the table and not getting a hell of a lot of good intelligence. They did a great job in the Pacific, not so much in the Atlantic theater. So what to do? And this is where our story changes, because we now are looking at a true hero of American intelligence, somebody who transformed the way we do things and still do things today because of the way this guy decided to take it upon himself to do scientific intelligence. Of course, I'm talking about General Leslie Groves.
With the cigarette in hand.
So the irony of this is wonderful. We do a lot of spy fiction, and every time there's spy fiction, we laugh when it's trying to be real. Like Argo, I showed you the Argo picture. Ben Affleck doesn't look like Tony Mendez. Tony Mendez is a wonderful man, but he ain't no Ben Affleck. Leslie Groves is a fantastic general, but when he was played in a movie in Fat Man and Little Boy, it was by Paul Newman. This is Paul Newman.
That's
Leslie Groves. Right. So Leslie gets a lot of grief, rightly so, by a lot of people on the left wing of the political spectrum, not just because he helped build the bomb, but because when Robert Oppenheimer, the man on the right, went through a lot of security clearance procedures in the 1950s under McCarthyism, Groves basically kind of sold him out. And so Groves gets a lot of bad press, but Groves has nothing to complain about since he looked like that, and this is who played him in the movie. So he's had karma's come around for Leslie Groves. But Groves is somebody who you may have heard of. He was the head of the Manhattan Project. He's the guy who helped to build the bomb. And actually, he becomes famous, and the reason he gets the Manhattan Project in the first place is because he helped to, he was an engineer that organized the building of a large
the Pentagon.
Yeah, the Pentagon, somewhere I drive by every single day. So Leslie Groves built the Pentagon. And you figure if you can build the world's largest office building, then he's the perfect guy to bring in to wrestle with all these scientists and to get them to build this bomb. So Groves takes charge. Now, it wasn't something where he said, I'll do it. He never would have been able to have the power to do that. When FDR finally said, how are we going to get someone who understands intelligence, at least a little bit, but also understands what's happening in the atomic world? Well, Leslie Groves is really the perfect guy for that. He spans two worlds. He gets the intelligence side because he's been fighting against any kind of penetration of the Manhattan Project, really focused on the Germans. The Germans didn't try. It was a whole other country that had penetrated the Manhattan Project. But he understood some of the basics of intelligence, having been a career Army officer. And of course, he wasn't a physicist, but he was surrounded by them. And so he understood a little bit of the ins and outs of the atomic bomb program, at least enough that he was better than everybody else. So FDR told George Marshall, who was the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, the most revered soldier in America, find someone to put in charge. Marshall said, Groves is our only guy. The problem was that Groves was outranked by everyone else he was dealing with. He had just been made a one-star general to run the Manhattan Project. He was a colonel when he built the Pentagon. And when they asked him to run the Manhattan Project, he said, on one condition, you need to give me a star. Because these, I was going to use a bad word, these
You can use it.
these bitchy scientists are not going to respect me unless I'm a general. So essentially, he demanded they give him a promotion to general. So he was as junior a brigadier general as you could possibly be. Now George Marshall wanted him to be in charge of all of atomic intelligence, which meant that he had to tell the director of the Office of Naval Intelligence, who was a two-star admiral, a senior two-star admiral. He had to tell the head of G2, who was a two-star general. And then he had to tell Bill Donovan, who was a two-star general retired, who was the most decorated soldier in American history. He's the only American who ever won the top 4 medals you can win as a soldier: the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and the Bronze Star. He was a legend. And so you got this newly minted brigadier who is now in charge of all these guys. The only way that could work is if Marshall himself went and talked to both the head of the ONI and the head of the G2 and said, I know you outrank this guy by years, but on atomic intelligence, he's in charge. You do what he asks. When he needs you to do something, you say, how high? You don't ask questions, he's in charge. And then Groves himself went and talked to Donovan in person. What's interesting about this, if you want to talk about how much the OSS was considered kind of the outcasts of the American intelligence community, Groves visited Donovan a year and a half after the OSS was stood up. So it had been around for 18 months by the time Groves went and visited Donovan in his office in Washington, D.C. Groves was the first general officer to go visit Donovan. Everyone else, when they wanted to deal with the OSS, just sent like a major or a captain or some lackey. Groves was the first person to actually have the respect for Donovan to go and talk to him in person. And what this did actually was to create a great bond between the two. Where Donovan said, look, I outrank you by leaps and bounds, but whatever you want, my phone, the door's always open, just call me and I'll help you out. And actually comes in handy several times during this period. A second key issue was trying to create a command and control system. And this was something that was pretty important at the point, because eventually they were going to want to send a mission into Europe. We could only do so much from the United States. You could only sit back and get second and third hand information coming from the scientific underground. What we needed to do was to send scientists with intelligence professionals right on the backs of the American and Allied forces moving into Italy and then France and then Germany. So this mission couldn't just happen overnight. You had to establish a command and control system for it eventually. And so they did. They brought people in and they created a hierarchy. And this is something that Groves wasn't particularly good at. He wasn't necessarily someone that we would call a hands-off manager. He called him a micromanager. The funny part about it is someone asked him, there's maybe 10 copies of this book in the world, but I found one of them. It was a MBA, a business school book from the 1960s, where it was essentially like management business practices. And it had a bunch of essays, chapters from different leaders throughout, like MacArthur had one in there. And Groves had a chapter in there about how to do management. And it was the shortest chapter in the book. It basically was what I say you do. And then you don't question it. You don't talk back. If you have a question about how to do it, I'll let you know how to do it. But no initiative, no anything else. But there were some people, and actually the 2 pictures here that Groves trusted. Really, the reason I have room for all the people Groves trusted is because it's these 2 dudes. That's it. So on the left is a man named John Lansdale, a lieutenant colonel. And he was brought on even before this mission began as the head of intelligence for the Manhattan Project. So it was his job not only to prevent, let's say, the Soviets, just kind of cherry picking there, from coming in and stealing secrets, but also for clearing all the scientists. So he cleared Robert Oppenheimer to work on the Manhattan Project. He was in charge of intelligence. And the man on the right is a guy named Major Robert Furman, or Bob Furman, who, once this program was stood up, was given the job to run the day-to-day operations of foreign intelligence. That's it. It was Furman, Lansdale, and Groves. And no one outside of that. Because Groves just did not trust anyone else to do this job. Now, fortunately, around this same time, they had the opportunity to talk to a prominent Dutch physicist by the name of Niels Bohr. Heard that name before, I mentioned it before too. Because he had just left, as the Nazis were sweeping into Europe, he had left his home in Denmark. They call him Dutch, I mean Danish. He left his home in Denmark and then moved to the UK, escaping the Nazi invasion, and then finally had come to the United States. And Justin Timberlake's better at this time. What he had done is, before he had left, had a long conversation with Werner Heisenberg. And this is the first time anyone had talked to Heisenberg and left Europe afterwards. And at the time, Heisenberg had told Bohr, trying to recruit Bohr into helping work on the German atomic bomb program. And Bohr came back and told us, like, they're working on it, they're getting close, they're getting it together. So that's something that worried us even more. We'll go quickly through some of these because of time. What the British knew, the British had been working on this program and this problem a little bit longer than we had, so Rose went over and did everything he could to try to exploit what the British knew. By exploit, I'm not using that word accidentally. This was not a two-way street. This was not like an intelligence sharing agreement. This was go in and find out what they know and then don't tell them anything. That was kind of Rose's way of doing things. The next was slowing the Germans down. Remember, we assumed they had a lead, and we assumed that they were way ahead of us. So how can we even things out a little bit? And part of this was using covert action. There's an Operation Gunner side. We talked about the Norwegian heavy water plant. Well, this was something we wanted to target. And there's several books about this. There's actually an old Norwegian movie about this, because 3 commando teams, they needed 3 because the first 2 got shot. Jesus. 3 commando teams like skied into the heavy water plant, crawled through air ducts, and then put bombs on the big tanks of heavy water, blowing them up. And actually were able to disable the entire heavy water plant. And they came back and reported to the British, that thing's out of commission for 2 years. Well, 3 months later, it was back in commission. So their estimate was a little bit off. And Groves was not about to wait around to send another mission. So he decided instead to send 140 B-17s to take care of the plant one way or another. And they dropped about 350,000 pounds of bombs on the target area. So the British were a little more subtle than we were in dealing with some of these problems. They had these guys sneaking in and crawling through ducts. Groves just said, send the Air Force, bomb the big Jesus out of it. And in doing so, kind of set a precedent. Since this worked as well as it did, I mean, it put the thing out of commission forever. He decided to use bombing raids across the board. He bombed the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes. He actually forced the German scientists to go out into the countryside. There's a reason that most of Germany right now was built in 1946. It is because of some of these bombing raids that were sent over there. There's even documents that I've read where they have conversations about the primary target are the buildings. But if you kill some of the scientists, that'd be all right. So they weren't the primary goal, but no one had any real qualms about taking out any of these German scientists. And then the final thing they had to really focus on was counterintelligence. Now, we all know in hindsight that they really, really were bad at this. Certainly the Soviet case is a key consideration here. But the counterintelligence aspect actually plays into the one before it, slowing the Germans down. And you can see a real handicap that Gross had was that he could not go full bore into trying to take out the German program. Because what happens if you bomb a Norwegian heavy water plant? You bomb a uranium mining facility in Czechoslovakia. You bomb the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Nuclear Physics. You bomb Heisenberg's house. You bomb Otto Hahn's house. What are you telling the Germans?
We know you're making a bomb.
Not only do we know that you're making a bomb, but what are we probably doing?
We have it.
We're making our bomb too, right? So he's handicapped by how much he can actually do. So his solution is not to not bomb everybody, but it's to bomb the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and then bomb a bunch of other stuff around it too. So let's mask our actual target by not only bombing one city with an important target in it, but let's bomb 4 other cities around it also. So there were times when Groves, again, a 1-star general, was able to call up Carl Spaatz, who was a 5-star, not Air Force, Army Air Corps, there was no Air Force at the time, general, and say, I need your entire Air Force. And so what's the target? Well, it's a factory. Well, how big? It sounds like it's a city. No, it's about 2 city blocks. Like, well, why do you need my entire Air Force? Well, I need to bomb that city and 4 other ones also to cover up the fact that I'm trying to bomb that factory. And because Marshall had given him all this power, a 5-star general had to tell a 1-star general, sure, whatever you need. And that's the extraordinary lengths that we're willing to go to figure out what was going on. And so there are times here where Groves can't go full bore, so he gets very creative. Another creative way of doing things was airspace control. Now, I live in a city where you can't fly over certain areas. Unfortunately, my neighborhood's not one of them. But where I work the Spy Museum is close enough to the White House, and we're blocked away from the FBI building. That's a no-fly zone. No-fly zones weren't all that well known at the time. And I don't know how some innovative German intelligence officer didn't pick this up, but there were really 3 major no-fly zones in the United States in the 1940s. Los Alamos, New Mexico, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington. In hindsight, you go, how did they miss that? How did anyone miss that? But Groves was able to literally say, no one can fly over these 3 locations, because I want to make sure that no one knows what we're doing. And the power of a 1-star general is extraordinary in this situation. But all of this leads up to this last bullet point, the mission. And the mission became known as Alsos. It was led by a man named Colonel Boris Pash. Now, Alsos is the name of the mission, and a lot of times missions are chosen at random, the names of these missions. There actually was an office inside the Pentagon whose job it was to come up with a bunch of potential names for a mission, and then they offer it to the commander, like Overlord, which was the D-Day invasion, was kind of randomly generated. And Market Garden, all these were randomly generated. Today, we get less creative. We have like Operation Iraqi Freedom, which is obviously not randomly generated. But everyone assumed Alsos was, right? It was one of these things like, all right, it's a weird name, but we'll accept it. Turns out it wasn't. Turns out there was a sycophantic person that wanted to impress Leslie Groves and chose Alsos in particular because anyone speak Greek in this room? I usually don't have Greek speakers. Every once in a while, someone will raise their hand and say, what does Alsos mean in Greek? And they say, it means grove. So some butt-kissing captain in the Pentagon named the mission Grove because Leslie Groves was the head of the mission. So by grove, I mean like grove trees, you know? So Groves found out about this. Someone on his staff was like, that's a weird name, that's your name. And he found out about it and he got furious, but at the time, what happens if he changes the name? Well, it's suspicious, right? If all of a sudden it's like Operation Dumbledore or something, then it's a whole other, everyone's like, why did they change the name? And people start looking into it. So he was stuck with basically saying Operation Leslie Groves, which if anyone knew what they were doing was key to understanding things about the Manhattan Project. So Pash is interesting. He's someone that one day there'll be a biography written about him, and I know this because I'm going to do it. This is a fascinating character that no one knows anything about. So he is, at the time, he's 43 years old. He's a lieutenant colonel of Russian ancestry. He actually was the son of a Russian Orthodox priest who had been born in the United States. He was born Boris Paskovsky in California, but had moved to Russia as a teenager. Now, that time happened to be during the Bolshevik Revolution, where he fought on the side of the White Russians, essentially the counter-Bolsheviks. He fought against Lenin and Stalin and all of them as a teenager. At 17 years old, he was basically fighting against Lenin and Stalin and the communists in Russia. He returned to the United States in the 20s when it became obvious that the Bolsheviks would not be overthrown, and became a PE teacher. So he was teaching phys ed, but at the same time, he was part of the Army Reserve. So he stuck around doing kind of the fighting, joined the Army Reserve, and was called to duty, to full-time active duty in Army intelligence in 1940 when the United States began to mobilize as we saw war on the horizon. So, interesting background because of the bitter opponent of communism that he was. He was assigned the task of investigating communist subversion in the San Francisco Berkeley area, and that was target-rich environment at the time. where his job required him to pay attention to a number of young, left-leaning scientists and technicians working in the many scientifically oriented laboratories in this area, many of whom were active members of the Communist Party of the United States, one of which was Robert Oppenheimer, one of which was his brother Frank Oppenheimer, and several other of the top people. And so he first came to the attention of Lansdale and Groves. Remember, Colonel Lansdale was the head of all Manhattan Project intelligence. When he became the liaison to the Manhattan Project for the Army Intelligence Group. And he just did things the right way. He was very competent, and he was somebody that didn't really put up with any garbage. And so he is someone that got along with Groves very well. So I love this quote, and this gave me an opportunity to put the word gobbledygook in my doctoral dissertation, so I jumped all over it. So this is how he talked. I imagine him being like a Sam Spade type character. Where he's like, yeah, that's it. So I had experience with General Groves while working on the Soviet espionage case. We always come to a speedy meeting of minds, and there's never been a question as whose mind was met. The general knew how to get results. He never tolerated the staff gobbledygook and beating around the bush, of which there was so much in Washington. He was exactly the kind of man you could depend upon in a national emergency. So Groves had found his guy, a person who he could trust from outside of his circle, which was kind of a big step for him, kind of accepting those on the outside to come in and run this mission for Groves that was going to be happening overseas. And so the Oslo mission actually begins in Italy. Because you know the background of the American and Allied invasion of Europe, we started in Italy. We jumped from North Africa and we kicked into Italy. And Italy was basically a dress rehearsal. There wasn't a whole lot that we could gather from what was happening in Italy. There were some scientists. The scientists were in Rome. And unfortunately, even though we invaded Italy in 1943, Rome doesn't fall. I remember the date Rome falls?
January.
Yeah, June 6, 1944. That's how I remember it, right? It's big mnemonic, right? Another important event that happens that day. Rome falls the same day we invade Normandy. So Pash and his team are just kind of sitting there twiddling their thumbs, waiting for Rome to fall. Now remember we talked about how good the relationship was between Groves and Donovan. While they couldn't go in, because remember these are scientists in a Jeep with Boris Pash driving it. This is not an armored fighting force of James Bond. The OSS was brought in, and an interesting character who we'll talk about again when the OSS comes in later, a man named Berg. Anyone heard the name Berg before? His real name was Morris, but he went by Mo. Berg is most famously known as one of the longest tenured Major League Baseball players of the 1920s and 1930s. He was a backup catcher, mainly for the Boston Red Sox. He was not very good at baseball. He played 14 or 15 years in Major League Baseball, hit 6 career home runs, even though he was 240 pounds, 6'3" guy. And he hit, I think his lifetime batting average was like a 234 lifetime batting average. But the reason he stuck around for so long is that he was so cerebral. He understood baseball better than anybody else did. He understood how to look at the ball and look at the spin of the ball and understand how physics, even though he didn't really know physics all that well at the time, understood the science of hitting. And so he just sat on the bench and talked to people and said, hey, look, the pitcher the last time started you out with a fastball and then went to a curveball. I know a little bit about this guy. He's going to go curveball, fastball next time and get you figured out. So the urban legend is that Berg taught Ted Williams how to hit. Now, you might have heard the name Ted Williams before. He's considered the greatest hitter by many people in the history of baseball. Berg, just during Williams' rookie year, just sat on the bench and chatted with him. And he kind of talked to him about hitting and talked to him about playing baseball. Now, that's not what makes Berg interesting. Berg was someone who was a polymath. He was good at lots of things. Baseball, not one of them, but good at a lot of other things. He spoke 12 languages fluently.
Wow.
Including languages like Sanskrit and Latin and Greek, but also Spanish and French and others. The joke around baseball was that he spoke 12 languages but couldn't hit many of them. Connie Mack, who was one of the most famous managers in all of baseball, a really weird dude, all him in his own right, said that Berg was the strangest man he'd ever met. I think today he probably would have been diagnosed as on the spectrum.
ADD.
I would think more on the autism spectrum. He was somebody, because of looking back, I'm not a psychologist, but he was the kind of person who would just, he never played. So he would sit on the bench and read newspapers all day. But if someone touched one of those newspapers before he read it, he had to throw it away and send someone out to get him a new one. And he just did not necessarily have the social skills to kind of be a normal human being. But he was an exceptionally good linguist. He was someone that spoke tons and tons of languages. And he was somebody who could be counted on to go and do just about anything he wanted to in the fight against the Nazis. Because as the name Boris Berg suggests, he was a Jewish American, grew up in Brooklyn. He was somebody that did whatever it took to beat Hitler. And so when the war kicked out, he volunteered to be in the OSS. His first mission actually was the parachute in the occupied Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was occupied by the Nazis, but there were two different partisan groups fighting against the Nazis. One was the former king of Yugoslavia and his group. Another was a communist by the name of Joseph Broz, otherwise known as Tito.
Yeah.
And FDR and Churchill were trying to figure out who should we support. Because we're only going to support one of them. We're going to funnel all of our money and resources and weapons to one of these partisan groups. They sent Berg in to meet with both and come back and determine which one was better. Went in, met with both of them, came back, told Churchill and FDR, Tito. Tito's your guy. And so all the funding, all the resources, all the weapons went to Tito. And you may know, Tito ended up being the head of Yugoslavia until he died in 1980. So Berg made a pretty good choice. Actually, the partisans under Tito were the only country in all of Europe to kick out the Nazis without outside help. So the Red Army didn't need to go in there like in Eastern Europe, and the British and the Americans and the French didn't need to go in there like Western Europe. Tito's partisans actually win the guerrilla war against the Nazis. And it's Berg's word that basically gives him all the power to do so. Well, after that, he basically was a jack of all trades for Bill Darwin. Wherever you needed to send him, they sent him. In this case, we needed him to go to Italy. He spoke Italian, that wasn't an issue. The issue was, you want to send him in to actually interview Italian physicists about the German atomic bomb program. What did we talk about before about spies not knowing anything about anything scientific? So Berg realized his shortcomings. He said, okay, look, I don't know anything about science, but I have about a 12-hour flight. So he took Max Planck's book, he took Max Born's book, he took some Heisenberg books in several different languages and learned quantum mechanics on the flight over from the United States to Italy. That's the guy we're talking about here. At least enough that he could have a coherent conversation with the two Italian physicists. The thing is, they didn't know anything. These were people that had been, the Italians at that point had been basically cut out of the Nazi planning at that point. But what it did, even though it doesn't come up with any real coherent information, it was a good dress rehearsal for how to move forward. And by the time they get to France, so essentially they follow on directly behind the D-Day invasion and get to France, they rush to one of their first main goals of capturing Frederick Joliot Curie. If you recognize the name Curie, he's the son-in-law of Marie Curie. His wife Irene Curie is actually the daughter. He takes her name, basically because the Curie name was a lot more famous at the time than the Joliot name. If your mother-in-law had 2 Nobel Prizes, you'd probably take her name too, if you're marrying into that family. And he was someone who the Nazis had leaned on. Even though he was a communist himself, he hated the Nazis. They essentially forced him to help work with them on the atomic bomb program. And we knew this. Basically said, we'll send you and your entire family and everyone you know to a concentration camp unless you help us a little bit. So he was someone we targeted. The problem was he was in France. And the bigger problem was he was in Paris. And Paris hadn't fallen yet by the time we wanted to get to him. So there's a great little story here about what Boris Pash's personality. And I don't know if this is true or not. I'd love to think this is true. It might be an anecdote, it might be just something. It appears in Boris Pash's, like, me and 4 of the people have read his autobiography. And there's a story in there about Leclerc. General Leclerc was the head of the Free French forces. He was de Gaulle's guy to go in and liberate Paris. And if you know, Eisenhower stops the U.S. military short of Paris to allow the French to go in to liberate their capital city from the Germans. The Germans had been defeated already, so let the French go in and be the first ones in. but the French were dilly-dallying. Leclerc just could not get off in gear to go in. And so Pash kept trying to get into Paris and kept getting stopped by Leclerc's forces, saying, no, we're not ready to go in yet, it's going to be tomorrow. And then the next day they'd come back, like, can we go in now? We got to get to this guy. And they'd, no, it'll be tomorrow. And eventually, again, according to the story, Pash drove up and had a bright idea. He drove up to the French tanks sitting there waiting to go into Paris and said, and they told him again, you can't go in, right? We're not ready to go. He's like, no. We had a unit of American tanks just get bored and rush into Paris. I have to run up ahead to stop them from going into Paris before you guys do. And they're like, oh my God, the Americans have double-crossed us. Go catch the tanks. So he takes off in the Jeep. No, there's no tanks. But this young French major runs back and calls back to Leclerc's headquarters and says, the Americans have double-crossed us. There are American tanks going into Paris. There's an American lieutenant colonel who just wants to try to stop them. But if you can't, they're going to beat us into Paris. And Leclerc said, suck it to or whatever Leclerc said, hung up the radio and ordered his entire army to invade Paris. So I love that story was true. If a lieutenant colonel in an American Jeep with a bunch of nerdy scientists were the reason that Paris gets liberated by the French because they finally get off their butts and do something about it, that's the way Pash tells it. That gives you a little bit of an idea. So finally they get to Paris. They're still dodging sniper fire. This is not a completely pacified Paris yet. And they capture Joliot Curie in his laboratory. And that gives them information about a key component to the quest to find out what's happening. Joliot Curie doesn't know a lot, but he does know, he heard through the scientific underground, that Strasbourg, which, depending on who you ask, is either on the border in France or in Germany. It's in the Alsace-Lorraine region. It's been passed back and forth about 20 times in the last 200 years between the French and the Germans. But he heard that Strasbourg was the center, essentially it was the Los Alamos of the German atomic bomb program. And this is really what the Alsace mission needed to hear. They were trying to hunt for where is the center mass of this mission. So at that point, they head straight to Strasbourg, and they find the mother lode. They find documents, they find the original kind of remnants of an atomic pile, a reactor that was, and this is the key, was about 2 years behind where Fermi was at Chicago. And the documents they collect actually had drawings of creating an implosion bomb, drawings of creating a gun design bomb, when we actually do. But they were so rudimentary that we realized that they were not even close to what we were doing. And the irony is, in 1942, when we decided to go full bore and to create the Manhattan Project, is the same time, almost to the week, where they decided to give up on their program. We didn't know this, of course, until the end of 1944. But Strasbourg was the mother lode. That gave us all the information that we needed. Now, we want to make sure, and this is where another Heisenberg story, another Berg story comes into play. You need to be familiar with this one. If not, this is kind of how we'll wrap things up. So we found out through the scientific underground that in December of 1944, Heisenberg would be giving another lecture in Zurich about matrix mechanics, which is what he was his Nobel Prize in. And we saw this as a key opportunity to do something about it. This wasn't going to be a go and talk to Heisenberg thing. This was going to be go to the talk that he was giving, and if it sounded like the Germans were close to building an atomic bomb, if the Strasbourg information was wrong, and they were actually close to building one, and we just didn't know about it, the person sent was supposed to stand up in the middle of the talk and shoot Heisenberg between the eyes, to assassinate Heisenberg. Now, who better to send in to do this than Boris Berg, the former backup catcher for the Boston Red Sox. So Berg is given this mission, and his German is pretty good. It's not fantastic. His physics has gotten okay, but he's listening to a guy talk about one of the most complicated matters in all of quantum physics, matrix mechanics. He goes to the talk, and sitting there waiting for it to start with a pistol in his pocket, his cover is as a Swiss physics grad student. And he's able to pull this off a little bit because the Germans are always kind of looking down upon the Swiss, and their accents aren't very good. They speak German, but they speak with a funny accent. And so his Brooklyn Jew German accent was the Germans at the time just didn't care enough about trying to differentiate between the Swiss, German, and anything else. It kind of all sounded the same to them. So he was able to kind of get away with it. So he's sitting there, small talking with all the other scientists who are sitting in front of him, waiting for Heisenberg to start. And the door opens, and in walks Otto Hahn, Hans Geiger, Karl von Weizsäcker, and 6 or 7 other people who were the top level of the German physics. And they sit down directly in front of Berg. So now he's sitting there waiting for Heisenberg to give a talk, and he has the entire German scientific leadership sitting in front of him. So he's thinking in his head going, well, if I have to kill Heisenberg, I'm going to shoot Heisenberg and just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down the line and take out the entire German high command as far as science is concerned. So he sits and he listens to the talk, and in the talk has nothing to do with anything practical. It's all about theoretical physics at a very high level. So Berg is nowhere near closer to knowing whether or not the Germans are building a bomb. But he gets himself invited to the after party. So when scientists have these conferences, they always have a wine and cheese after party to kind of hobnob with one another. And Berg kind of gets his way in there to where all these top physicists are chatting around, and he's sitting there again pretending that he's a Swiss grad student, hearing Heisenberg say the things that he really needed to hear him say. Heisenberg wasn't talking about the Germans about to win the war because of an atomic bomb. He wasn't talking about his allegiance to Hitler. Heisenberg was holding court saying, all I hope is that the Allies will let me do science after the war, that they'll let me rebuild my institute, that they won't be too mean to us after they beat us in this war, that Hitler won't take us all down with him. That was enough for Berg. But why not leave it there? So when Heisenberg's about to leave, Berg says, all right, I'll leave now too. And the two of them walked together, just them, back to their hotel, chatting about physics, all these other things. And to finally, when they parted for the night, Heisenberg said, well, good luck on your dissertation. I'll see you next time I'm back in Switzerland. Not having any idea that he was talking to, again, a Jewish kid from Brooklyn whose German was horrendous. But Heisenberg thought he was a Swiss. And not realizing that Berg had a loaded pistol in his pocket the entire time, ready to shoot Heisenberg between the eyes if he had muttered anything about, well, we got this new thing coming out that's going to change the war. In fact, Heisenberg didn't find out about the Berg mission until about 10 years after the war ended. And then it was declassified, and you can imagine the kind of shock about how close to death he actually was. Berg's story is interesting. After the war ends, he actually joins CIA. But CIA, as we talked about before, OSS had no rules. And that Berg loved the fact that it had no rules. CIA was a real bureaucracy. And so Berg didn't last for very long with the CIA. He spent the rest of his life couch surfing his way around the world, learning new languages and learning new cultures. And essentially did that until he died. Now the final thing on here is Farm Hall. I'm going to skip Operation Harbor because it's like a 20-minute story. I'm already going way long. Farm Hall was a culmination of Alsace, Germany. In Alsace, Germany, when we finally invade Germany, our forces go in right behind the leading front, and we end up capturing all of these top German scientists, Hahn and Geiger and von Weizsäcker, and eventually we finally capture Werner Heisenberg. But before we do, actually Heisenberg is hiding in the Black Hills of Germany, gorgeous resort area. If you've ever been there, it's worth going to. It's essentially as beautiful as it gets in Central Europe, and he has a house there, and so he's kind of sitting out the war, hoping that no one notices him and doesn't kill him. But we find him there, and he's all ready to go. He knew we were coming. This is a couple days before the end of the war, and he literally, when Boris Pash kicked down his door, he had his suitcase already packed, ready to go. He had heard the Americans were coming into town, and he was hoping it was the Americans because he didn't want to be captured by the Soviets at this point. The problem was that Heisenberg was all ready, but Pash and his group weren't. They needed to refuel their jeeps, they needed to get some food, and by the time they did that, it started to get dark. And so they said, all right, let's just spend the night, and we'll leave first thing the next morning. So Pash and his team, there's about 6 scientists, and then Pash, who's an army officer, are sitting inside this small house a couple blocks down from Heisenberg, and there's a banging on the door. And they open it very quietly, and there is a 3-star SS general standing at the door, coming in and saying, I'm here, I'm the commander of this SS Panzer Division, and I'm here to surrender to your general. And Pash, quick thinking, thankfully, said, well, my general's in the back, he's not feeling very well, He's got loose bowels. So he can't come out and surrender, but come back about noon tomorrow, and you can surrender your division to the American soldiers that are here. Now this is important because if the SS Panther Division had found out that there were 7 Americans and not an entire U.S. Army Corps sitting in that area, Pash and his top scientists would have been massacred. But very quick thinking, he said, come back at noon tomorrow, my general will feel better, hopefully by then you can surrender at that time. Well, needless to say, they got up really early, grabbed Heisenberg and got the hell out of there as fast as they possibly could. Now the last thing on there is Farm Hall. This is a brilliant idea by the British. All of these men, and they're all men, were used to being treated like kings because they were the royalty of Nazi science. So when they went to England, we captured them, brought them back to England, they assumed they were going to be treated very well. And we did actually treat them very well. There was a British manor out in the middle of the countryside, think of Downton Abbey, called Farm Hall, where we put them up in these beautiful rooms and we fed them 3 fantastic British foods. We fed them 3 pretty good meals a day, and we treated them like kings. Everyone was Doctor this or Doctor that or General this or General that, and we didn't, it was not a prison. It was a nice way of being kind of detained after the war. So they felt free to be themselves, to have conversations, to talk about how the war played out, how the research played out, and what they wanted to do after the war, not realizing that every inch of Farm Hall was bugged. Not just the light fixtures, the beds, the bedposts, the walls, everything was bugged. So we actually have from this, and it's fascinating, there's audio recordings. If you speak German, there's audio recordings of this. If you don't, it's been transcribed into English, of hours and hours and hours of conversations that they had about everything from high-level science to how much they hated Hitler to maybe the Soviets would be better if we defect to the Soviets. That kind of freaked everybody out a little bit after the war. And actually what ends up happening is because Heisenberg and his group are saying, I wonder who's going to treat us better, the Soviets or the Americans, then we dump so much money into rebuilding German science after the war because of the fear that they're going to go over to the Soviet side. So we have, and talk about a fly on the wall of some of those prominent, important people during the war, and they had no idea that they were being listened to. That wraps up that key component of the intelligence history here. Look, there's a whole lot more to this, but I don't want to keep you here forever, and I certainly want to give you the opportunity to ask any questions that you might have about anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be about this story. This is an opportunity, anything you want to know about intelligence, but we're afraid to ask, kind of thing too as well. So I think I saw his hand up first, and I saw you here. So, sir in the white shirt in the back.
Oh, thank you for being here. Oh, I don't know if this is working.
You probably just turn it up.
It's on.
You gotta push that little.
I probably have a loud enough voice anyways. Thank you for giving this, the speech tonight. How effective was Greta Garbo with the OSS?
So, not very. I mean, there are other actresses that were exceptionally. Marlene Dietrich was one that was fantastic.
Marlene Dietrich.
Yeah, so Dietrich's an interesting story because she worked for a program called the Morale Branch, the OSS. It was to create propaganda. If you don't know the Marlene Dietrich story, she was the world's most famous actress and singer in the 1930s. There's not even a Hollywood equivalent today. So it would be Julia Roberts back in the 90s when she was like the greatest actress around. So Dietrich was someone that was loved both in Europe and the United States. She came to Hollywood in the 30s like everyone did. When Hitler came to power, he ordered her to come back to Germany. She hated Hitler, so she said no and became an American citizen instead. And then when World War II broke out, she joined the OSS under this morale branch. There's an operation called Operation Muzak that was designed to create music to be used as propaganda. And she recorded a bunch of sad dirges about how wonderful it would be to be sitting back by the fire in Berlin with your honey eating Wiener Schnitzel and not fighting on the front and dying against the Americans and the Allies. And this was broadcast and they sent this into Germany. And of course, seeing their most beloved actress and singer basically working against them as a propaganda tool was dehumanizing for the Germans. And this might be apocryphal also. I've seen evidence in actual documents of this. So after the war, anyone heard the strategic bombing survey that was done after the war?
Yeah.
So we bombed Germany back to the Stone Age with the idea that if we killed enough civilians, they'd want to quit eventually. Doesn't work. It was a strategy that the British had. That's why we killed 50,000 people at Dresden and then another 40,000 people at Berlin. Most of them were civilians. But the strategy was you kill the civilians put pressure on the government, and they'll stop the war. We didn't know it didn't work all that well at the end of the war, so we sent in a survey team. So essentially, people who are doing, looking at statistics, statisticians, and people who did economic research and things like that. Some of these scientists that I talked about in the kind of the very beginning, doing operations research, to do a kind of a door-to-door, although there weren't a lot of doors left, so a rubble-to-rubble survey of the German people, and they asked them these questions about how well did the strategic bombing work. And of course, that question is really asking, how dehumanized and demoralized were you by us bombing the living crap out of you? And one of the answers I've seen written down was, look, the bombing was bad, but not as bad as that damn frickin' Marlene Dietrich singing her damn, I'm paraphrasing the language. It's a lot more salty than that. But there's at least one person that was more affected by Marlene Dietrich's Operation Muzak songs than by being bombed back into the Stone Age. So it does give you a little bit of an idea of how propaganda can be used. Now, I don't think anyone in today's day and age needs to understand how information can be used as a weapon. No one who wasn't under a rock in November of 2016 certainly doesn't need to be told that. But information warfare, because certainly this propaganda was relatively new at the time, and Dietrich was a pretty strong weapon in that case.
Why did the Germans give up on the bomb program in 42?
So why did the Germans give up on the bomb program in 42? So this is one of those crazy stories also where it was a math error. It was as simple as a math error. And this is one of those too crazy to be true, but it is true stories. So they were trying to calculate the amount of uranium-235 necessary to create a critical mass and a chain reaction. Now, they'd done the physics, but it was a lot of incredibly complicated math. So they actually had one of the world's greatest mathematicians. And they gave it to him, and they said, do this math problem for us to figure out how many kilograms of uranium-235 we're going to need to create a critical mass. So he sat down, and then talking about differential equations and multivariable calculus and stuff that's way beyond most people's understanding of mathematics, but this is one of the greatest mathematicians in the world. And he did the equation out, and it took several pages. And at the end, he said, it's going to take a order of 10 magnitude more than it actually was. So basically, he overestimated by times 10 of the actual, so let's say you only need 5 kilograms of uranium-235 to make, I'm not giving you exact numbers, partially because they're still quasi-classified, but he said 50, right? 10 times as much. And that was his official pronouncement. And because he was who he was, and because the Germans are very keen on kind of ceremony, and these were people who were considered revered, and the greatest mathematician in the world, no one checked his math. It would be the equivalent of us not carrying a 1 in a long division problem. It wasn't a major math mistake. It was something very basic. A first-year grad student would have picked up on it and said, no. Oh yeah, no, it's 10 times less than you think it is. But no one checked it. Because no one's going to check on this guy because this guy is the greatest mathematician. Now, what that mattered is that Albert Speer, who was the head of production, essentially, for the Nazi high command, he went to Heisenberg and said, you're going to go talk to Hitler, and you're going to let him know how the likelihood is of building an atomic bomb. And this was right after all this math was done. So Heisenberg and Speer went to Hitler, and Hitler basically asked them 2 questions. Can you build it? And how much is it going to take, resource-wise, to build it? Heisenberg tackled the second question first. He said, well, we know now how much uranium we'll need to build a bomb. It's this much, and that's going to mean that you're going to have to expend an immense amount of resources to build this weapon. And you're probably going to have to stop building submarines and stop building tanks and maybe cut back on your fighter aircraft production to build an atomic bomb. So Hitler was like, okay, if it's going to win the war, maybe we'll talk about doing that. Then that first question was more important. Can you build it? And Heisenberg, being a scientist, was honest. Maybe. I mean, I think so. I mean, think about the Manhattan Project, right? On the Trinity test, July 16, 1945, in Alamogordo, New Mexico, the first actual explosion of an atomic bomb. 5 minutes before that, Enrico Fermi had a betting pool going about what would happen. Some people would argue that, you heard this story, it's amazing. So he had they had a betting pool.
Chain reaction of the planet.
Right, so Fermi said it's going to set fire to the atmosphere and kill everyone. So I don't know how he was going to win. His betting came close. But there were a lot of scientists who were actually saying, it's not going to work. It's just not going to work, right? So even the Americans in July of 1945 were saying, we'll find out, right? We'll find out. And they did, of course. And the first indication that the science worked, the science that was on a chalkboard a couple years ago, was that explosion in Alamogordo at Trinity. So Heisenberg, in 1942, was like, hell if I know. I think we can pull this off. And so Hitler, the combination of an immense amount of resources that we can't choose to spend, because we're not the United States, right? Even if we thought it was 10 times as much, we have the resources to do that and still build ships and aircraft and everything else. Germany did not have that luxury. They're fighting a two-front war. They didn't have the resources that we did. He would have to pick and choose. And he wasn't willing to give up on the production of warfighting equipment that actually might help him win the war for something that maybe one day might help him win. And so it's we call this counterfactual history, where the what ifs of history. Historians don't like to officially talk about counterfactuals, but get us at 2 in the morning in a bar and we'll talk to you about the what ifs all you want to. But the what if there is, what if Heisenberg had walked in with the right numbers and said, no, it's going to be 1/10 as bad, and I think we can pull this off. You're only going to have to cut back a little bit on wartime production to actually make this work. You might have a very different history. Who knows? But that's how it went. Yes, sir.
With all that intelligence work, how did they miss Klaus Fuchs?
So there's a whole 5-hour lecture on the counterintelligence side. No, it's a great question though. Not just Fuchs. How did they miss David Greenglass? How did they miss Alan M. May? How did they miss the Rosenbergs? The one that actually, and I've been studying this for a long time. I'm a lot older than I look. There was a man named George Kovacs. Have you heard that name before? So all the Manhattan Project spies were actually what we define as spies. Now, I use that word with a very specific definition, because if you work for the CIA, you're not a spy. You're an intelligence officer, or you're a case officer, or you're an analyst. The spy is the person you go overseas and recruit from their country to give you the information, the traitor. So 99% of the people who worked in the Manhattan Project that were the bad guys were spies. They were Americans, they were Brits, they were Eastern European immigrants who were recruited by the Soviets to give them information. But there was one Soviet intelligence officer that infiltrated the Manhattan Project, worked for the GRU, for Soviet military intelligence, and was sent over and got a job with the Manhattan Project, actually as a safety officer for the Manhattan Project. Now, why does it matter? What does a safety officer have access to? Everything. And this is it's a 20-minute story, but it's fantastic in that he looked really young, and he had taken an electrical engineering degree already from the Soviets. When they sent him over to the United States to act as though he was a high school senior applying for colleges, they're like, this is the smartest high school kid we've ever run into. He's a natural at electrical engineering, so he aced he's the smartest kid in every class, but he already had a damn degree, right? I mean, send me back to freshman year history classes and watch me thrive, right? So that's basically where this guy was, and at the exact same time as when the Manhattan Project was talent scouting. So they were going to these universities saying, who are your smartest kids? I'm like, well, this Kovacs guy is awesome, right? He knows more than everybody else, he's your guy. So they brought him on. Not only was he the science and safety officer for Los Alamos, but for the entire Manhattan Project. So he went to Hanford, he went to Oak Ridge, he went to DC, and saw everything there was to see. That guy got them more information. Now, Fuchs was important, particularly for the development of not only first the Soviet atomic bomb, but their eventual development of the hydrogen bomb. They missed him because we were looking to win a war. Right? That was our ¡1 priority. Get the smartest people in the room to help us beat the Nazis. You had to accept people who were left-leaning. You had to accept people who at one point had affiliation with the Communist Party. Because there are certain Republicans today who like to argue that the universities are hotbeds of liberalism, right? There aren't any conservative professors anymore. Go back to the 1930s, right? And try to find a conservative professor, especially in the sciences. They were all internationalists. They were all lefties. They were all pinkos, right? They weren't full-fledged communists. They were fellow travelers. I mean, Oppenheimer's a great example of this, right? Oppenheimer he never had the membership card, but he might as well have it, right? His mistress was a militant communist. His brother Frank was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. All these people were security problems, potentially. So you just had to kind of suck it up and win the war you were fighting and worry about the Soviets later on. And that's why so many people slipped through the cracks.
What was that person's name?
Which one?
The agent that...
Well, his real name was something crazy Russian. I don't remember off the top of my head. But he came over as George Koval. So it's K-O-V-A-L, but they Czechicized it a little bit because he was an immigrant. So there's a lot more letters in his real Russian name. But he came over as K-O-V-A-L. And his
Like
first name
Stalin.
was anglicized as George. Say again?
Like Stalin.
Well, right.
It's a
Well, and
Houghton.
like everyone else. Like, yeah.
Was the FBI involved in prosecuting throughout any of the...
Well, so yes, and root out some of the spies, yeah, absolutely, the spies for sure. The FBI was interesting, because Hoover wanted full control over everything. And actually, people think of the FBI as a domestic intelligence agency. At the time, domestic actually meant the entire Western Hemisphere. So the FBI was actually in charge of intelligence all the way down into South and Central America. This changed when the OSS came onto the picture. And that was a lot of early infighting between Donovan and Hoover. I mean, these are the heavyweights of American politics. And Donovan actually wins out because he had the ear of Roosevelt. Even though, talk about team of rivals, Donovan was a hardcore Republican. He had run for governor as a Republican. He had been a huge anti-New Deal FDR hater. But he and FDR saw eye to eye on foreign policy. And so he brought him on to be the OSS commander. Now, Hoover never really got over this. And when the OSS is disbanded and then about a year and a half later becomes CIA, there's a couple steps in between CIG and SSU, but becomes CIA, Hoover still hates the people because essentially the CIA was founded by all former OSS people. And that's why they don't get along until Hoover dies in 1972. And I could argue they don't get along all that well today, but that was something that Hoover was really,
Good reason.
well, there are times when there's key differences between what their mission is, right? The FBI's mission is to collect evidence. Even the counterintelligence side is to collect evidence to get someone tried and put in prison. The CIA doesn't care about putting them in prison. The CIA's job is to collect intelligence. So sometimes they don't come together. I mean, 9/11 and the lead up to 9/11 is a great example of that, right? Or even after, right? Abu Zubaydah, who was the first big Al-Qaeda guy that we captured, was captured and interrogated at first by the FBI. And the FBI, named Ali Soufan, an FBI agent, very famous, has a whole advisory group now in New York City. Ali Soufan interrogated Abu Zubaydah for a couple weeks. And the CIA came in and said, well, what do you got about future attacks? What do you got about Al-Qaeda's leadership? What do you have? And he's like, that's not the questions I'm asking him. I'm asking questions so I can put him on trial and get him prosecuted. And I'm asking him questions to help me gather evidence so that I can prosecute people who are responsible for 9/11. And CIA was like, we don't care about that. We care about the next group of planes that are going to be flying into buildings. We care about what we're going to have to do in Afghanistan, where these guys are, so we can go and we can kill them so they don't do this again. And both missions are important. But you can see how these agencies are coming at them from very different directions. So the CIA was able to put pressure on the DOJ, actually the bosses of the FBI, and say, look, the pressing issue is stopping a 9/13 or a 9/14 or a 9/15 next attack. So get the FBI the hell out of here and let us in. And in hindsight, that was a problematic idea for us, because the guys who went in and created a program, that capital E, capital I, capital T, enhanced interrogation technique program, which included waterboarding and stress positions and these things that are still controversial to this day and made us look really terrible in the world. Whether they work or not, you can debate all you want to, but I've seen a lot of the response from the international community, and we lost a lot of prestige doing that. So, different missions. And those different missions go back to the time of the Second World War also, where these agencies are looking to do different things. Yes?
How much of this information actually went through Tijuana for the Manhattan Project? How much of the stolen secrets went through Mexico?
Not a hell of a lot. There's an overstatement and I think a misperception about how much was stolen and how important the information was. I think that there's a easy knee-jerk reaction to say the Soviets got the bomb because they stole it from the United States. I think that is dramatically underestimating the capabilities of the Soviet scientists. Absolutely. And so when this, about a year and change from now, the second half of this is focusing on the Soviet program, and the book juxtaposes the two, and it's not time for it tonight, but looking at the Soviet side, and our problem was, we said the Nazis had the greatest scientists in the world. No one was better than the Nazis, and they can't build a bomb. So the Soviets, who have trouble making a two-person tractor, and have a bunch of bumpkins, there's no way they're building a bomb. Leslie Groves looked at the Germans who had the greatest facilities in the world, had access to all these raw materials and all this information, and they couldn't build a bomb. Looked at the Soviets, who have no raw materials that we knew of, had an industry that had been destroyed by the war, and said they're not building a bomb for 20 years. Truman, President of the United States, looked at the Germans and said, these are the Germans, these are the people of this ancient, the Huns going back to ancient society. They built, this is the society of Mozart, this is the society of Bach. And then looked at the Soviets, which he actively called Asiatics, and said they'll never build a bomb. Never. That underestimation was what got us caught by surprise. We got caught with our pants down because we thought they were idiots. When you had people, this is the country of Mendeleev who created the modern periodic table. This is the country of Mendel who created modern genetics. This is the country of Igor Kurchatov who was the Robert Oppenheimer, right? This is Yuri Gagarin, right? They beat us into space. These aren't idiots. These are people that are as good as our guys are. And because there's a totalitarian society, they don't have to play around with how do we, make sure that democracy and modern capitalist economics are going to allow us to build a program. They said, no, don't build any more tractors. Don't build any more cars. Build me a bomb. So a lot of the perception that the Soviets stole the atomic bomb from us, that Robert Oppenheimer was some kind of a left-winger, or that Julius Rosenberg should have been executed, I'm not a believer in that. I think that is a excuse that we latched onto because of McCarthyism. It was an excuse that we latched onto because it was easier than saying we were so wrong about our assessment of our enemy. Because think about it this way. If they know what they're doing, if they're good scientists, if they're capable of building these kind of weapons on their own, then we're in big trouble. Right? Think about how we're thinking about that in 1948, 1949, and 1950. When we think that we're the best, we're the superpower, and the only way they can build a bomb is by to steal it, that's comforting to us, right? We're comforted that, oh no, they're a bunch of bumpkin idiots, but they got a bomb because they stole it from us. It's much scarier to think they're as good as we are, right? And that is kind of the thing that we did not want to embrace. And so kind of this myth of the atomic spies and being as important as they were, I guess was promulgated. Am I being waved off? Okay. So I can answer a question on the side. I'm sorry, they're waving me off, but I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you for coming out tonight. There it is, 1-0. One nothing who?
Golden Knights?
All right, good. So you won this one goal. And I appreciate it. Look, if you're ever in Washington D.C., come check out our museum. We'd love to have you guys. So I would never bring this up on my own, but I'm being told I have to do this.
I'm a fan.
So we do have a podcast at a museum. It's called Spycast. I didn't choose the title, but it's our brand now, where once a week, every Tuesday, we release a new conversation. Essentially, it's me talking to someone interesting in the world of intelligence for about an hour. Very informal. Everyone from former directors of agencies, Michael Hayden, David Petraeus, 6 or 7 former CIA directors, sometimes current directors of agencies, sometimes former case officers, former analysts, journalists who deal with intelligence work, people like Chuck Todd talking about elections intelligence, people talking about everything from climate change and the national security implications of that to baseball and spying in baseball. So just Google it. We're all over the place, and I find it really entertaining. I only talk to the people that I want to talk to. That's my metric about who I ask to come on, and we have done a really good job of getting some interesting people. The one we just dropped on Tuesday, I talked to a guy who worked for the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, and he's the program director of something called the Mad Scientist Initiative. And essentially, it's people whose job is to think so far outside the box about the crazy technologies that could be around in 2030 or 2040 and 2050, and then plan for how to deal with those. So, talk about a fun job. Sitting around and thinking about cool stuff, and that's their job. So we have a long conversation about how intelligence plays into that, because you kind of need to be thinking in a kind of spy way, not only to understand people's current capabilities, but also what direction technology is changing. And so check it out. We've done about 330 of them now, so there's probably something for all of you. And then you might get hooked.
This guy is great.
Might get hooked hopefully your whole family now. We're going to work in that way. Linda here has. So I appreciate you taking the time and enjoy your night.